Anatomy, Musculoskeletal System, Temporal Bone. The temporal bone is an even and symmetrical bone in the cranial box that forms part of the base, to a small extent, the vault. The temporal bone is very important since, in addition to its structural function, as far as the skull is concerned, it acts as a protection for some nervous organs and has numerous axes and channels for both vascular and nervous structures. Let's go see it in detail. The temporal bone cannot be properly classified as a flat bone due to an internal protrusion called rocca petrosa or temporal pyramid. To describe it, we may identify the extracranial aspect and the endocranial aspect. The extracranial aspect has a region called squama, which is posteriorly divided from the mastoid region by a suture called petrosquamous fissure. The squama is a simple flat portion, convex on the outside and concave on the inside. On the inside, we can find the signs of cerebral circumvolutions. On the outside, we can see small ridges for some muscle attachment. In its inner portion, the origin of the zygomatic process starts from the squama and extends forward to articulate with the zygomatic bone. It forms between the squama and the zygomatic process a fossa, called mandibular fossa, where the mandible condyle articulates to form the temporomandibular articulation. As for the mastoid portion, on the other hand, it has a stubby pointed process, or the mastoid process, which limits the opening of the mandible and which has a series of cells called mastoid cells that communicate with the tympanic cord. Another portion of the external aspect is represented by the external acoustic meatus, the entry point to the acoustic canal, which is occluded by the eardrum. Immediately after it is the tympanic cord. There is also a small spine called suprameatal spine that externally limits this foramen. In addition, the bone forms around the meatus a kind of lip that is incomplete posterior inferiorly and partly completed by the spine. The lower part of the outer aspect of the temporal bone corresponds to the basilar part of the pyramid. Notable structures are the styloid process, which is shaped like a stylus and gives rise to several muscles and ligaments. In the entrance to the carotid canal, the point where the internal carotid artery enters the temporal bone and then exits at the apex of the pyramid. And in addition, there is also a hole called the stylomastoid hole, which is located in front of the opening of the facial canal. Medially to the mastoid process, there is a suture, which houses the internal jugular vein that then enters inside the skull at the jugular opening formed by the temporal and occipital bones. The endocranial aspect of the bone is a bit more complex due to the pyramid of the temporal bone, a highly irregular structure. The limit between squama and rocca is given by the petrosquamous fissure, and whatever comes after is considered part of the pyramid. The upper aspect of the pyramid has a region at the tympanic cavity called the tegmen tympani, which is the roof of the tympanic cavity. Immediately after this, there is a structure called the arcuate eminence. After this, there are two canaliculi. One is the canal of the small petrosal nerve, and the other is the hiatus of the facial canal, while the large petrosal nerve runs. Overall, this is the description of the structures on the upper aspect of the pyramid. The upper aspect is then marked off by the upper sharp margin in the anterior-inferior margin that divides it from the portion that lies forward and that can be seen from the outside. There is then an interior aspect which lies between the upper and lower aspects called the anterior aspect. Here there is the canal for the auditory tube. We just described the lower aspect as the extracranial portion. Then there is the posterior aspect of the pyramid, on which there are very interesting structures. First of all, the internal acoustic meatus, which is the region from which the eighth encephalic nerve, the statoacoustic nerve, originates. We can then see a tract with the imprint of a spiral consisting of small foramina, technically called tractus spiralis foraminosus, and is the point where the statoacoustic nerve originates, collecting the efferents from the cochlea. In addition, still in the posterior aspect of the pyramid, there is the petrosal fossa, a simple imprint. In addition to this, on the posterior aspect near the internal acoustic meatus, there is also the opening of the vestibule aqueduct, a structure through which the vestibule exchanges its fluid with the CSF. The base of the pyramid extends to the squama and petrous part. On the other hand, the apex is hollow and constitutes the opening of the carotid canal, which crosses the entire bone, entering from the outside and then goes into the skull and then runs over the sphenoid body. By dissecting the bone, we can realize that the canal descends to the bottom until it joins the outermost opening. The pyramid of the temporal bone has a very complex structure, which is represented by the cochlea in semicircular canals, around which the bone is built to form its ideal space. Lastly, we can observe the endocranial aspect of the mastoid process, where the mastoid foramen that connects the cells with the interior of the skull is located. For the purpose of observing the skull as a whole, the structure formed on the posterior aspect of the pyramid by the articulation with the occipital bone is significant. The small spine or jugular process will allow the formation of a jugular foramen along with the occipital bone, which will be crossed by the internal jugular vein. This video was created thanks to Anatomy Learning, an interesting free web app. The hyperlink can be found in the description. Instead, the text used for the concepts is Human Anatomy of Eddie Hermes. Thanks for watching.